Hi, everybody. This is Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Friday, January 25th, and I'm doing an episode of Q&A today. So I'm taking questions from viewers, and they're kind of random. They're sort of all over the place. So I'll go through each of them. Caroline asks, my question, when do you use the natal chart? I was born in Switzerland, and when the relocation? I've been in Los Angeles for over 20 years. One big difference is the ascendant. So the question is, when do you use your birth chart as cast from the location of your birth, and when would you use the chart of a chart cast of the same day and time that you were born, but relocated to wherever you're living now? So my answer to that is just based on my own practice. It's not something that I recommend doing, actually. I just say to stick with your birth chart. To me, the birth chart it's indicating your karma in life, and it tells us about where you'll live, where you'll move, when you'll move. It tells us about who you are. And I don't think your karma alters based on where you live. So that's my personal belief. I don't mean to sound like a jerk, but I personally think that changing your birth chart to a different location is not I don't think it's a particularly valid astrological practice. I don't mean to be a jerk, because some people may practice it and really love it, and that's cool. I'm not into it personally. So that would be my answer. It's a good question. I probably sound like a grouch about it, but my honest answer is keep the birth chart the birth chart. I think that the birth chart gives you a picture of your karma for your life, and I think that it includes within its range of possibilities all the different places you move and live, and I mean it's a picture of your life. So I would just keep the birth chart myself. So thank you for that question, Caroline. All right, continuing on. Another question was, what if there is a lot of activity in a house where in life you have nothing going on? Catherine says, for example, I have Cancer rising, so currently a pile up in Capricorn in the 7th house of relationships, but I have no significant other or open enemies or business partners or anyone in that role. And then she gives the example of her son who has something similar going on. So the answer to this is a little bit more complicated. First of all, it's very important to understand the natal promise in your chart. So sometimes your natal chart will give you information about relationships, and it's possible that your natal karma, your natal destiny, is not to have a lot of partners in life, or to have any. Not to, freak anybody out, but that is a possibility. Most astrologers won't dare to tell someone that it doesn't look like they're going to have a lot of, deep, long, meaningful relationships, that they may live a more lonely or single lifestyle, or maybe very fulfilling life alone. No one, we don't like to deliver this kind of news to people. But the truth is that the birth chart tells us about the condition of our karma in our relationships, and we have to understand that first, because transits can't deliver something that the natal chart isn't telling us is there. So that'd be my first kind of basic answer. My second answer is that there's a lot of time to go yet with regard to the eclipses that are happening in Capricorn and Cancer, with regard to the upcoming conjunction between Saturn and Pluto, what to speak of Jupiter eventually entering Capricorn. So that 7th house of yours is going to be active for a while. Sometimes it takes a while for, planets are spending a long time in a house. It's not always right away that you experience the karma in that area of life. So you still have a ways to go, and maybe something could still happen. Maybe someone enters your life, or there are 7th house activities that bloom in the next year, 2 years, or so and so forth. The third answer is that, remember, transits are one of many techniques that we use in order to understand when natal promise is likely to manifest in the life of the individual. When is your natal karma going to show up? So you're born with things that are going to grow and express themselves in your life. Like who knew what age it would be that you would meet your spouse, or that you would go through a divorce, or that your father would die, but these are things that are built into our karma from the time that we arrive here. So there's also something to be said for understanding that not every transit through your seventh house, even ones that seem like they should be a big deal, are all equal to one another and will all express themselves in the same way. So transits to the seventh house often will depend on time lords. Are there any active time lords for the year? Is it a perfection year focused on your seventh house? There's also multiple planets in a birth chart that could refer to love or relationships in particular. Venus, for example, sometimes is a better planetary indicator than the ruler of the seventh house. It's different in every chart. There's usually multiple things that we have to explore in order to time out exactly when important events in a certain topical area of life may occur. So the third thing, again, is just to remember that transits are one of many techniques that we're really trying to use together cooperatively so that we can tell when things are likely to happen. So for those reasons, I would say don't give up faith. Maybe something's still destined to occur in your seventh house even the near future. On the other hand, understand the natal promise, very important, so that you can understand what types of events are likely to occur and maybe how often. Also, again, reiterating the third point, which is that transits and timing techniques are usually, you have to use multiple timing techniques at once to really get a sense of exactly when something is likely to occur. Transits are not even the most sort of popular timing predictive technique in the history of astrology. So just things to think about. So thank you, Catherine, for that question. That was a good one. Let's see. Danny has a question. When interpreting what areas of life an eclipse will affect, should one look to the house placement of the ruler of the nodes as well as the house placement of the nodes themselves? So this is a great question. It's basically a how to interpret eclipses question. So I'm just going to give you some basic steps. When you're interpreting an eclipse, start with the whole sign house that the eclipse is happening in. It's going to be like for Capricorn Cancer, you're going to have a solar eclipse in Cancer or Capricorn, or you're going to have a lunar eclipse in Cancer or Capricorn. Start by focusing on the topics of that house. Those are the topics that will be most prominent, most activated at the time of the eclipse or going forward after the eclipse. In a larger sense, the axis of the two houses, understood as a complementary set of topics, will be activated over the course of all of the eclipses. And then in terms of looking at the rulers, yes, if you want to understand some of the inner workings of an eclipse, for example, when the moon is in Cancer, it's in its own home sign. So those eclipses aren't going to involve a dispositor, and the node, if it's also in Cancer, is not going to involve a dispositor. But let's say that you're in, it's an eclipse is in Sagittarius. It's a lunar eclipse in Sagittarius. At the time of that lunar eclipse, look and see where Jupiter is in your chart. There will probably be a connection between the dispositor of the eclipse, meaning the ruler of the node and the sign the eclipse is happening in, and the eclipse itself, joining together a set of topics. So yeah, you definitely want to look at the rulers. Don't give too much importance to the rulers, though, because a lot of times what happens when people are learning to interpret charts is too many details, too many things being compiled together complicate the interpretation more than it needs to be. Stick with the topics of the house. Really focus on that as a starting point, because a lot of the times what we do in astrology is by adding too many components, we miss the target. We miss the target altogether. It's like throwing a dart at a dartboard. You're trying to get so close to the perfect bullseye by taking so many things into account. And if you do that, a lot of times you have a tendency to throw the dart and miss the board altogether. Whereas if you throw in a general direction toward what you know generally to be true about the eclipse, a lot of the times, first of all, you'll hit the board more often than not. You'll be on the right track. But then more often than not, if you keep doing that over time, keeping it general, then when you start adding secondary details like where's the ruler of the eclipse if it's not in its home sign, then that secondary level of information often becomes more intuitive and instinctual to include. And then you get closer to the bullseye. So that's my advice for interpreting eclipses. Okay. Let's see. Jessica wants to know if, while reading transits, one should consider the dignity of the transiting planet, and how the dignity of the transiting planet compares to the dignity of the natal planet. So she gives this example. Let's say that you have Capricorn rising and Aquarius in the second house, both ruled by Saturn. Saturn is in Capricorn in the first house. So very strong, well-dignified Saturn governs the second house of finances. It's in the first house. Then she says, so what if you have Jupiter coming over that Saturn? Jupiter in Capricorn is in its fall. It's a difficult position for Jupiter. But because Saturn is strong natally, what should we pay more attention to? The strength of Saturn's natal dignity or the debility of the transiting Jupiter? So I'm going to talk out both sides of my mouth for a second, because first I'm going to say that you should just always think first of the natal promise. So in this case, a debilitated Jupiter transiting over natal Saturn isn't going to radically change the nature of Saturn in your birth chart and what you should expect Saturn to deliver, being in its own sign, ruling the house of finances, in the first house, an angular house. In other words, finances will be good, though qualified by Saturn, meaning maybe they involve hard work, or maybe they exhaust you somehow in the first house a little bit, or maybe you take them too seriously, or so maybe a little bit of Saturn kind of heaviness surrounding it, but it should be very strong, sort of strong Saturnine finances. Where you blend the themes of strength of Saturn related to finances. If it's in a daytime chart, especially when it's in sect, then you have a very constructive Saturn related to financial merit in life. So you may gain as you age, especially. Saturn likes time. So Jupiter's not going to change that radically by being in Capricorn. It's not going to have a huge impact on that. It's going to, Jupiter, what is Jupiter's baseline too? Jupiter brings growth. So the fact that it's in its depression, you take that into consideration and you say, okay, so maybe, although overall this should be a good thing, there are some qualified Jupiterian difficulties, like being overly ambitious and maybe a little greedy or something. So there's gain, but there's some lessons involved like that. Overall, this isn't going to be something that like radically alters the natal promise, in other words. So I hope that helps in terms of how to consider the dignity of a transiting planet in relation to the dignity of a natal planet. It does matter, but it also doesn't matter as much as the natal promise. Keep that first. Okay, so thanks, Jessica, for that question. That was a very good one. Let's see. Kathy has a question. When looking at a chart and starting to delineate or interpret, should I pay more attention to planets in houses, or should I pay more attention to empty houses? Does it matter? Good question. It doesn't really matter. It's not the deciding factor. Sometimes the ruler of an empty house will be incredibly important in the life of an individual. So let's say your fourth house is empty, but the ruler of the fourth house is an exalted Saturn in a good house, a good sign. That will mean that the prominence of the fourth house topics in the native's life are very, they're there to be seen. They're very important. So, there's prominence surrounding home, family, maybe wealth, foundations. So Saturn, exalted ruler of the fourth house. Saturn's the ruler of the fourth house and it's exalted. Very important. There's no planets in the fourth house, but some people might think, well, it's empty, it must mean it's not as important. No, the ruler's position can give it great prominence and importance as a set of topics in the life. On the other hand, planets inside of a house, for example, a couple of planets in the fifth house may not matter that much at all compared to a whole glom of planets in the 10th. So every chart is so contextual that you can never really read in such simplistic terms, like pay more attention to planets versus, unplaneted houses or something like that. Of course, one of the guidelines for how to indicate which planets are the most important are of the sun, moon, and rising, the sun, moon, and ruler of the ascendant. Are any of those angular? Is it a daytime or nighttime chart? What are the dignity of the lights? Things like that. Is there a benefic that's insect in an angle? A lot of questions things that we check for to get a sense of which planets really stand out that really don't have anything to do with whether a house is empty or not in the first place. So that's just an aside to let you know that the real way that we end up organizing our approach to interpreting a birth chart is complicated. It's sort of elaborate. And that's why we study. I mean, that's why come take my new class. We're starting a new class in June. All right. So thank you, Kathy, for that question. Let's see. I think I have one more from Annie. She's wondering if the 10th, 4th houses are still considered angular, if the midheaven IC axis lies in the 11th and 5th houses or 9th and 3rd houses. If someone's midheaven is in Scorpio and their ascendant is in Capricorn, would Sag be both succedent and cadent? No. So this is basically a question that boils down to what's the difference between, say, the 10th house and the midheaven and the 4th house and the IC. So I've already explained this in a previous video when I talked about the difference between the 10th house and the midheaven. The basic difference is that the whole sign 10th house represents the point of the zodiac and the sign containing that point that are exactly 90 degrees from the ascendant. So it's along the ecliptic, which defines the zodiac. Along the ecliptic, it is the high point of the ecliptic in the circle relative to the horizon, the eastern horizon and the western horizon. So that high point is a sort of zodiacal high point in the sky. But the midheaven is the meridian line that runs from due south to due north, and the intersecting of the sun, for example, with the ecliptic every day is where we get high noon, and it divides the eastern half of the sky from the western half of the sky, the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun. So those 2 points astronomically do not always coincide with one another, yet they both have symbolic importance in astrology because they're both related to things that are lifted on high: honor, advancement, promotion, kings, CEOs, queens, and so forth. So conceptually, they're very similar, but we only call the midheaven as a degree is not a house. It's a point. It's a sensitive degree. It may fall in the 9th, 10th, or 11th, but the only thing that we would call an angular house would be the 10th in that regard. Same thing for the 4th and the IC. So no, if the midheaven is in the 9th house, you wouldn't call the 9th house angular. You would call that a declining or cadent house. The 10th is the angular house. So, but the degree of the midheaven and the 10th house may carry similar symbolic meaning. So hopefully that helps, Annie. Thank you for your question. All right. I think that is it. Yes. Okay, great. So that's what I've got for today. Some really good questions that came in from people. I hope that you're all having a very nice week, that you have a very beautiful weekend. I will be over the weekend working on my written horoscopes for February and all my video horoscopes for February and my month summary for February. So I'll be busy doing that. I may do something little over the weekend, probably written edition. So that's what's coming up, and I look forward to seeing you guys after the weekend. Take care. Bye.